Yes, the question of gladiators and their physiques. That's a good comment that you make, by the way. I'm going to get into it a bit. I'll start with talking about the point that you make about them being chubby. First of all, we don't really know what gladiators look like. Yeah, we've got mosaics, we've got depictions of them, but they might be idealized. Perhaps they did represent what they look like. I think a better way of considering what they look like athletically would be the fact that they trained a particular way and they had a not great diet. I mean, they had an okay diet, but we know, for example, that meat was very rare because it was expensive. So if you put those two things together, they trained a lot and they weren't eating a great deal, you're probably coming out with a body type that would have been leaner. Whenever I see a gladiator sort of show, film, whatever, and you've got these guys who are just huge, I always think, no. I don't. There's no way they didn't have a nutritionist with shakes on stand every 2 minutes to have creatine sandwiches and things in order for them to get big. So they wouldn't have been big guys by any standards. They would have been lean. You make the point about them being chubby. There is an idea that they would have been fed, some of the better ones or the more prized ones would have been fed a bit more. The idea was you gave them a layer of fat which might add a bit of protection against the sword cut from perhaps preventing it going too deeply. But that's sort of an aside. What I want to talk about is what I think are the ways in which the gladiatorial physique has been informed by modern conventions, because it's often the way. And to do that, I need to talk about the 20th century. I need to talk about the 50s or thereabouts, because in the 50s and 60s in Italy, you have something called the peplum, sword and sandal. So you know Ben-Hur, films like that. Well, Italian cinema did something similar on a cheaper financial scale. And what they tended to do was pick a story from the Bible. It might be Samson or it might be Hercules from myth. And they'd have an actor playing that individual, but they would be bodybuilders. So, for example, Steve Reeves is a good instance of one. Reg Park's another who I'll get to in a moment, because he has an association with someone you will have heard of if you haven't already heard of those other two actors. And it was really popular. People really liked it because you have these really massive guys on screen and people aren't perhaps as exposed to that kind of physique as they would be. So it's really interesting. Everyone likes those kind of films, or did at the time. Very popular, as I said. So I think from that point on, there's an expectation. I do wonder if that expectation of the physique that a gladiator would have tracks against what's conventionally thought of as the aesthetic ideal at the time. So, for example, it's got leaner. I think the ones where you have gladiators now, if they're looking for a person to play, you know that person's doing a sort of Hugh Jackman Wolverine fitness regime for 6 months to get into shape for it, because that's what we think of when we think of gladiators, but it's probably not really the case. But going back to Reg Park. So Reg Park was a British bodybuilder. He got into making films, did really well out of it. And he spoke to another bodybuilder. He advised him to get into films. He said, you've got an incredible physique, which he did, still does in a way. You need to get into films. You need to get into these kind of films, paying big, strong men. And this actor did. And he starred in a film called Hercules in New York, which is bizarre. Watch it. It's got the greatest bear fight you'll ever see on cinema. And that particular bodybuilder was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger got into films because of this tradition. But it didn't do very well. I don't think he enjoyed it. In fact, he's not even credited as Arnold Schwarzenegger. I seem to remember him being credited as Arnold Strang or Arnold Strong, because I thought Schwarzenegger, that's a ridiculous name. Hollywood will never like it. Yeah, that went well. So obviously with Arnie, he did very well later on. But initially his break was sort of tapping into that tradition of the big guy on screen playing a gladiator. And as I said, I wonder now whether, to what extent we'd ever go back to what we might think of is a conventional representation, a real representation of a gladiator versus, what we expect of perhaps it is the conventional, I suppose, now, that you have incredible six-pack, lean, 0.1% body fat, that kind of thing, which is probably not the case because, again, to get that kind of physique, you've got to have a dietitian, you've got to have a personal trainer, you've got to have a lot of resources. Not really something they had. As I said, they didn't have creatine sandwiches and protein shakes aplenty at the gladiator training barracks. Hard work, but perhaps none of those other things. Anyway, thanks again for the comment, and thanks for sticking me for almost 5 minutes.